At 14:23 hours on September 19, 1944, the air near Saint-Malo, France, hung thick with the damp chill of a late summer afternoon, carrying the faint acrid scent of gunpowder and damp earth. Corporal Thomas Bennett hunkered low behind his M5 3-inch anti-tank gun, nested deep in the tangled greenery of a hedgerow that rose like a natural fortress above the open field beyond. His gaze was locked, unblinking, on 5 German Panther tanks, their dark gray hulls glinting faintly in the overcast light as they rumbled steadily across the grassy expanse, 800 yards distant. His palms were clammy with sweat, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered near the gun's controls, the cold metal biting through his gloves. For 6 interminable hours, his crew had lain motionless in this cramped position, their muscles stiff and their nerves frayed, watching the panzers maneuver back and forth across the field all morning, waiting patiently for the enemy to draw near enough for a decisive, clean shot. Now that moment had finally arrived, but Bennett's gut screamed that clinging to the textbook playbook, the rigid protocols drilled into every gunner, would be a death sentence for him and every man beside him. The M5 was a reliable weapon, powerful, precise, capable of piercing 3 inches of armor at 1,000 yards when operated exactly as instructed. But exactly meant firing at a depression angle of -5 degrees or an elevation angle no greater than 15 degrees, the parameters for which the gun was engineered, the angles every gunnery manual drilled into crews. Stray beyond those limits, and the recoil mechanism could fail catastrophically, potentially destroying the gun outright and certainly voiding any maintenance guarantees. The trouble lay in the terrain. The hedgerow where Bennett's gun was in place stood a full 12 feet above the undulating field below, its dense network of roots and branches providing scant but crucial cover. Meanwhile, the Panthers were advancing through a shallow, sunken hollow, a natural depression in the terrain that dipped another 8 feet below the field surface, masking much of their hulls from view. To engage them using the Army's approved firing angles, Bennett would have to wait until the tanks climbed out of that depression, their full frontal armor exposed and closed to within 300 yards, maybe even closer if the terrain demanded it. At that range, the Panther's crew would spot the bright flash of his gun's muzzle in an instant, their superior optics locking onto his position before he could even reload. A single shot from one of their powerful 75mm cannons would be enough to wipe out his gun and crew, turning their carefully dug emplacement into a crater of twisted metal and debris. The Panthers boasted 80mm frontal armor, sloped at a steep 55-degree angle, a devious design that caused incoming shells to glance off harmlessly or absorb the brunt of their impact, even when they struck true. The M5 could, in theory, punch through that armor, but only with a perfectly angled hit at the exact right range, and only if Bennett could fire first, before the enemy even knew he was there. His commanding officer, 2nd Lieutenant James Walsh, 24 years old, just 8 weeks into his tour in France, had memorized the manual and insisted on following protocol. "Wait," Walsh urged repeatedly. "Wait for them to get closer. Wait for the right angle. Wait for the textbook shot." Bennett, however, brought 11 months of experience as a gunner to the fight. He'd served in North Africa before deploying to France, firing on German tanks 23 times and scoring 17 hits. But he'd never considered what he was contemplating now, defying the elevation limits, risking his own gun to land a critical blow. The manual was unambiguous: maximum elevation 15 degrees. Anything more could snap the recoil springs, crack the mount, and turn a functional anti-tank gun into useless scrap. Yet over the past 6 grueling hours, Bennett had done more than just wait. He had meticulously studied the battlefield, calculating angles in his head, estimating distances with the precision of a surveyor, and tracking every subtle movement of the Panthers as they navigated the field. He knew their path by heart, had memorized every dip and rise in the terrain. He knew the depression they were traversing would keep them below his line of sight for just 8 more minutes. After that, they would crest the rise and the tables would turn. They'd be too close, their guns fully capable of hitting his position before he could land a second shot. His crew wouldn't stand a chance, not against 5 of the most fearsome tanks in the German arsenal. There was only one way to hit them now, only one chance to turn the tide. Elevate the gun to 32 degrees, far beyond the manual's limits, fire a high-trajectory shot that arced high into the sky, and let gravity do the rest, dropping the shell directly onto the Panther's thin, nearly unprotected top armor. The top plating was a mere 40 millimeters thick, barely enough to stop a heavy machine gun round, and a 3-inch armor-piercing shell descending at a steep downward angle would slice through it like a hot knife through butter. The risk was enormous. A 32-degree elevation was more than double the approved maximum. The recoil forces would be staggering. The gun might survive one shot, maybe three, but eventually something would give. Springs, mount, or traverse mechanism, leaving them defenseless as 5 Panthers bore down. Walsh still pressed him to lower the barrel, his voice tinged with fear. He wasn't foolish. He understood the danger of waiting, but he also knew the consequences if superior officers learned they deliberately violated firing protocols. Bennett glanced at his loader, 20-year-old Rodriguez from Texas. A good soldier, fast with the shells, but clearly terrified. In that instant, Bennett made a decision that would either save his crew or land them in a court-martial. He kept the gun elevated at 32 degrees. What unfolded over the next 4 minutes would reshape how American anti-tank crews engaged German armor for the remainder of the war. The German Panther tank was, without a doubt, the deadliest armored vehicle American troops had faced in the brutal fighting across France during the summer and fall of 1944. It wasn't the heaviest. That distinction belonged to the fearsome Tiger the Fern with its impenetrable 100-millimeter frontal armor. But the Panther was far more numerous, far more agile, and in many ways far more lethal on the rolling, hedgerow-lined battlefields of Normandy. By September, the 5th Panzer Army had nearly 200 operational Panthers in the Normandy theater, and American anti-tank crews encountered them almost daily, their growling engines and distinctive sloped hulls striking fear into the hearts of even the most seasoned soldiers. The Panther's frontal armor was nearly twice as thick as that of the American Sherman tank, 80 millimeters of hardened steel, sloped at a sharp 55-degree angle. This slope design was a masterstroke of engineering, causing incoming shells to glance off harmlessly or absorb much of their kinetic impact, even when they managed to strike the armor directly, turning potentially fatal hits into useless glancing blows. American 3-inch anti-tank guns could, in theory, defeat that fearsome armor, but only at dangerously close range, usually under 500 yards and often much closer. And at that distance, the Panther's own 75-millimeter gun, with its superior accuracy and high-velocity rounds, could destroy an American anti-tank position with a single, well-placed shot. The math of combat was ruthless, inescapable. To kill a Panther from the front, you had to let it get close enough to kill you first. Bennett had witnessed this grim, deadly equation play out 11 times over the course of his service. 7 times in the baking deserts of North Africa. 4 times in the mud and blood of France. He'd seen brave crews wait patiently for the textbook range, fire their shots with steady hands, sometimes hitting, sometimes missing, only to be annihilated by the Panther's inevitable, devastating counterfire. German gunners were among the best in the world, highly trained, disciplined, and equipped with optics that allowed them to spot even the faintest movement from hundreds of yards away. Spot a single muzzle flash, and you had roughly 8 seconds before a 75-millimeter shell came screaming toward your position, a death knell in the form of a whistling shriek. In North Africa, Bennett's battalion had lost 14 anti-tank guns in 3 weeks of fighting Panthers and Tigers, most destroyed after firing just 1 or 2 shots, their crews killed alongside them. Bennett had survived only because his gun had been positioned behind a ridge that offered a clear escape route after firing. But such luxury was rare. The approved doctrine for engaging Panthers was shoot and scoot, fire 1 or 2 rounds, then immediately relocate before the enemy could return fire. It sounded sound in theory, but in practice, moving a 3,000-pound anti-tank gun under fire was nearly impossible. Hitching the gun to a truck or half-track, loading it and speeding away took 2 to 3 minutes, time enough for a Panther to close 300 yards and fire 6 to 8 rounds. Shoot and scoot only worked if you had space to maneuver and time to escape, and Bennett's position near St. Lo offered neither. The hedgerows were dense, the roads narrow, and his gun was dug in so securely that extracting it would take 15 minutes. His crew had no way out. They would fight there until the Panthers were dead or they were. The terrain only compounded the problem. Standard anti-tank doctrine assumed engagements on level ground or against slightly lower targets. The 15-degree maximum elevation was intended for shooting at hills or elevated positions. It covered most combat scenarios, but not Bennett's. His gun sat 12 feet above the field, while the Panthers were 8 feet below it in a depression, creating a 20-foot vertical gap the manual never addressed. Waiting for the Panthers to climb out would give him the textbook flat trajectory shot at 500 yards, with a high chance of penetration, but it would also let the enemy see him, fire back, and likely wipe out his entire crew. Bennett's resolve to break the rules had been forged in the fire of loss, in the faces of friends he'd watched die because the Army's doctrine couldn't keep up with the reality of the battlefield. He'd lost good men to Panthers, men like Corporal Mike Stevens, a fellow gunner he'd trained with side by side at Fort Hood back in 1943. Stevens was a quiet kid from Michigan with dreams of becoming a high school history teacher after the war, of telling his students about the fight for freedom rather than living it. On July 28th, near the town of Coutances, Stevens' gun crew had engaged two Panthers at 400 yards, right at the edge of the M5's effective frontal range. He'd fired 3 shots, his aim true, 2 hits on the first Panther and a third that penetrated the second's frontal armor. The crew had cheered, a rare moment of joy amid the carnage, thinking they'd won the day. But then the second Panther, though damaged, had managed to rotate its turret, and its gun had roared. The shell tore through Stevens' gun shield like it was cardboard, killing Stevens and his loader instantly, their bodies crushed beneath the weight of the exploding gun. The rest of the crew had scattered, lucky to escape with their lives. Bennett had heard about it 2 days later, and the news had settled in his chest like a lead weight. Stevens would never get to teach that history class. Worse still was the loss he'd witnessed firsthand, a memory that haunted his dreams long after the sun went down. On August 15th, near the village of Mortain, a gun crew from the 2nd Battalion had positioned themselves on a rocky ridge overlooking a narrow country road, their M5 dug in behind a pile of loose stones. 4 Panthers had rumbled up the road in tight column, their engines roaring, their treads churning up dust and gravel. The American crew had waited, as they'd been trained to do, until the lead Panther was just 300 yards away, perfect textbook range, before firing. The shell struck the Panther's lower glossus, the so-called weak point of the frontal armor, but it bounced off harmlessly, a dull clang echoing across the valley. The Panther had stopped dead in its tracks, its turret rotating slowly, methodically, as it searched for the source of the fire. The American crew had scrambled to reload, their movements frantic, their hands shaking. Bennett had been 600 yards away with his own gun, too far to intervene, too far to help. He could only watch through his binoculars as the tragedy unfolded. The Panther's gun had fired once, a bright flash cutting through the dust, and the American position had erupted in a ball of flame and smoke. The force of the blast had thrown one crewman 30 feet into a dry ditch, where he lay motionless, his body broken. The other 4 crew members had died where they stood, incinerated by the explosion or crushed by the collapsing gun mount. Bennett had closed his eyes for a moment, the image seared into his mind, and knew then that the old ways weren't working. After Mortain, Bennett had begun to question everything. The manual demanded close range, frontal armor weak points, and multiple shots. But every time crews followed those rules, people died. His battalion had entered the Normandy campaign with 18 anti-tank guns. By mid-September, only 11 remained. 7 guns destroyed, 23 crewmen killed, 16 wounded. The issue wasn't courage or training. American gunners were brave and skilled. But doctrine designed for fighting Panzer IIIs and IVs was no match for the Panther. Some crews had tried adapting, setting up in defilade to expose only the gun barrel, until Panthers learned to target the barrel itself, or ambushing to hit thin side armor, a risky gambit requiring perfect timing. The sound of a Panther's 75mm gun firing would haunt Bennett forever, a sharp crack followed by a whistling shriek as the shell closed in. If you heard it in a gun position, You had 2 seconds at most to dive for cover. Usually there was no time, only frozen terror, waiting to see if the shell would hit. Bennett had nightmares about that sound. So did Rodriguez. So did most of the crew. They never spoke of it, but the fear was visible in their eyes every morning as they manned the gun. Lieutenant Walsh, a good officer who cared for his men, clung to the manual because that's what lieutenants did. Follow orders, trust doctrine, believe procedures existed for a reason. But Bennett believed something else. The manual was wrong, and the crew behind him deserved a chance to go home alive. The lead Panther was now 750 yards away, still in the depression, still unaware of their presence. Bennett pulled the trigger. The recoil that followed was unlike anything Bennett had ever felt in his 11 months as a gunner. A violent, bone-rattling jolt that seemed to shake the very earth beneath his feet. At normal elevation angles, the M5 kicked back smoothly, the recoil springs absorbing most of the force, the mount holding steady as if it were anchored to bedrock. The crew barely felt it, a mere vibration that faded almost as soon as it began. But at 32 degrees, everything changed. The gun bucked upward like a wild stallion rearing up, its barrel lurching toward the sky with terrifying force. The entire mount shuddered violently, metal screeching against metal in a high-pitched wail that made Bennett's teeth ache. The recoil springs compressed so violently that he could hear them groan, a deep, ominous sound that made him fear they would snap at any moment, sending the gun careening backward into the crew. For a split second, time seemed to stand still, and Bennett thought the whole assembly would tear itself apart, turning their only weapon into a pile of useless scrap. The shell, meanwhile, arced high into the gray September sky, a tiny black speck disappearing against the dense, heavy clouds that hung low over the battlefield. He counted the seconds aloud, his voice steady despite the chaos. 3, 4, 5. He'd calculated the trajectory 100 times in his head over the past 6 hours, had run the numbers until they were burned into his memory, but he had no way of knowing if he'd gotten it right. Elevation plus gravity plus distance equals impact point. It sounded simple on paper, but this was the first time he'd ever tested it at such an extreme angle. The first time he'd gambled everything on a theory. At 8 seconds, the shell struck. It hit the lead Panther's engine deck at a nearly vertical angle, the force of its descent amplifying its power exponentially. The 40mm top armor, designed only to stop shrapnel and small arms fire, gave way instantly, the shell slicing through it like it were paper. The armor-piercing solid shot had no explosive filler, no bright flash, no concussive blast, but it didn't need it. The kinetic energy of the shell, accelerated by gravity as it plummeted from the sky, was enough to tear through the engine compartment like a tornado. It shredded fuel lines, snapped electrical wires, and ignited the engine oil, turning the interior of the tank into an inferno. Flames erupted from the Panther's rear deck, bright orange and yellow, licking at the sky as black smoke billowed upward in a thick, choking cloud. The tank ground to a halt, its engine sputtering and dying with a final, guttural groan, its treads locking up as the fire consumed its internal systems. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the distant wind rustling through the hedgerows. Bennett let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, his hands still gripping the gun's controls, his heart pounding in his chest. The other 4 Panthers stopped short, their commanders scrambling to identify the threat. They'd heard the gunfire, but the angle was incomprehensible. Anti-tank guns didn't shoot from above at steep angles. Their training, their experience, told them it was impossible. They scanned the hedgerows at ground level, missing the danger above. Bennett didn't hesitate. Rodriguez, moving with lightning speed, slammed a second armor-piercing shell into the breach. Bennett aimed at the second Panther, kept the elevation at 32 degrees, and fired again. Another violent recoil, another groan from the springs, but the gun held. This time Bennett counted carefully. 8 seconds later, the shell crashed into the second Panther's turret roof, where the armor was a mere 25 millimeters thick. It punched through effortlessly into the crew compartment. The Panther stopped, black smoke billowing from its hatches. Finally, the remaining 3 Panthers understood. The threat was above them. They began reversing frantically, trying to escape the depression, but the 60-ton tanks accelerated slowly in reverse. Bennett had time for one more shot. Rodriguez loaded a third shell. Bennett adjusted his aim to account for the Panther's backward movement and fired. The shell hit the third Panther's turret ring, the weakest structural point on the vehicle. It didn't penetrate fully, but it jammed the turret traverse mechanism, crippling the tank. The crew bailed out 20 seconds later, running for the tree line. The last two Panthers escaped behind a ridge. In 90 seconds, 3 Panthers destroyed or disabled. 0 return fire. Bennett's crew was alive. The gun still worked. Lieutenant Walsh stood staring at Bennett, mouth agape. Finally, he managed 4 words. "How did you know?" Bennett shook his head. "I didn't know. I guessed, calculated, hoped. But I didn't know until the first shell hit." Neither of them realized 6 other American anti-tank crews had watched the entire engagement from nearby positions. Bennett's high-angle shot worked because of 3 factors the gunnery manual had ignored: geometry, gravity, and German doctrine. Panther tanks had been designed with one thing in mind: flat ground combat, the open plains and rolling hills, where tank versus tank battles were fought head-on. Their armor was thickest where German engineers had expected attacks to come. 80 millimeters on the frontal glasses, 60 millimeters on the turret front, 50 millimeters on the sides, all sloped at angles designed to deflect incoming rounds. The engineers had run countless calculations, had anticipated every possible threat they could imagine: frontal assaults, flanking attacks, ambushes from concealed positions. But they had never, not once, anticipated attacks from above. The Panther's top armor was an afterthought. A thin layer of steel meant only to protect the crew from shell fragments and shrapnel from artillery airbursts. On the engine deck, it was 40 millimeters thick. On the turret roof, a mere 25 millimeters. That was enough to stop a grenade or a stray machine gun round, but it was no match for a 3-inch armor-piercing shell descending at high velocity, its entire kinetic energy focused on a single, tiny point. The German engineers had outsmarted themselves, focusing so much on defending against frontal and side attacks that they'd left the tank's most vulnerable spot exposed. The physics were unforgiving. A shell coming down at 30 degrees or more hit with enough force to punch through thin armor, like a hammer through plywood. Gravity amplified its power. Bennett's shell climbed to roughly 200 feet above the target before plummeting, striking the Panther's engine deck at nearly the same velocity it had left the barrel. And unlike frontal shots, which hit sloped armor that could deflect even powerful shells, high-angle shots struck flat, horizontal surfaces. No deflection, just direct impact on the tank's weakest point. German tankers had no training to counter this threat. Their doctrine assumed anti-tank guns fired from ground level or slightly elevated positions, 15 degrees maximum. They were trained to spot muzzle flashes at those angles, to identify firing positions in hedgerows and buildings at eye level. When shells rained down from above, they were confused. Some thought it was artillery, but artillery lacked the accuracy to hit individual tanks repeatedly. Those precious seconds of confusion gave Bennett's crew the edge. The risk to Bennett's gun was real. The M5's recoil mechanism was rated for 15 degrees maximum elevation. At 32 degrees, the recoil forces tripled, pushing the springs and mount beyond their design limits. Each shot was a gamble, but Bennett knew waiting meant death. Guns could be replaced. His crew couldn't. After the engagement, Walsh inspected the gun. The recoil springs were compressed but intact. The traverse mechanism functional. The barrel slightly bent, maybe half a degree, but usable with recalibration. In his inspection log, Walsh noted the gun had engaged enemy armor at extended range, but said nothing about the elevation angle, nothing about violating every firing protocol in the book. When Bennett asked why, Walsh replied, "Because it worked, because the crew is alive. That's all that matters." Within an hour, 3 other gun crews from the battalion arrived at Bennett's position, asking how he'd destroyed the Panthers, how he'd used that angle, if they could try it too. Bennett showed them, explained the math, warned them about the recoil stress, and told them the technique might destroy their guns. All 3 crews said they didn't care. The technique spread through the 2nd Battalion in 3 days, passed from gun crew to gun crew, corporal to corporal. No one wrote it down. No one reported it to division headquarters. Gunners just talked, demonstrated the angles, and explained how to calculate trajectory based on elevation and distance. By September 22nd, 9 guns in the battalion were using high-angle shots against Panthers. Staff Sergeant William Parker was the second gunner to adopt the method. Positioned 2 miles east of Bennett, he'd watched the engagement through binoculars, stunned by the arcing shells. After the Panthers retreated, he walked to Bennett's position and asked for a step-by-step explanation. Bennett taught him the math: 32-degree elevation for targets 700 to 900 yards away, 28-degree for closer ones, adjusting for wind and shell weight. Parker took notes on a scrap of paper, returned to his crew, and told them they were changing tactics. His loader, 19-year-old Jimmy Kowalski from Chicago, asked if the gun would survive. Maybe, maybe not, Parker said. But the standard method hasn't kept us alive. 3 crews in our company are dead. I'm not letting us be the 4th. On September 21st, Parker's gun engaged 4 Panthers near Vere. He elevated to 30 degrees, fired at 850 yards, and hit the lead Panther's turret roof. The shell penetrated, and the tank stopped cold, smoke pouring from every hatch. Parker fired 3 more shots, hitting 2 more Panthers. The 4th escaped. His gun survived all 4 shots. That evening, Parker gathered 5 other gun commanders behind the maintenance area, out of officers' earshot, drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, and explained the angles and Panther weak points. When asked what would happen if superior officers found out, Parker said, "I'd rather face a court-martial than watch more crews die for a manual that doesn't work." By the end of September, the technique had spread to the 3rd Battalion and parts of the 1st, roughly 25 guns total. Crews kept it quiet, practicing the angles in secret and using it only in combat. The results were dramatic. In August, the 2nd Battalion had lost 7 anti-tank guns to Panthers. In September, only 2. The kill ratio reversed, with American crews destroying Panthers at a 2-to-1 rate in some engagements. Division headquarters noticed the improved statistics, but attributed them to better training, positioning, and coordination. No one told them the truth. The technique had limitations. It only worked when crews had an elevation advantage, and aiming was harder. Gunners had to estimate trajectory without seeing the impact point until the shell hit. Recoil stress was cumulative. Bennett's gun lasted 18 high-angle shots before a recoil spring fractured. Parker's lasted 22. Another broke after 7. But even with these flaws, it saved lives. Crews survived engagements they would have lost using standard doctrine, killing Panthers from ranges where the enemy couldn't effectively return fire. German Panther crews began reporting the unusual attacks in late September. 5th Panzer Army combat reports mentioned tanks destroyed by top armor hits from steeply angled shells. Initially dismissed as artillery strikes, the pattern became clear by early October. American anti-tank guns were firing at impossible elevations. The Germans called it plunging fire, a tactic they'd seen from artillery but never from direct-fire anti-tank weapons. Their intelligence officers searched for new American gun systems, but reconnaissance confirmed it was the same M5 3-inch guns they'd faced for months. The only change was how the Americans used them. German commanders adapted, avoiding low ground and sticking to ridges to negate the elevation advantage, limiting their mobility, or rushing American positions to close distance quickly. Some crews welded spare track links or metal plates to their top armor, but the added weight reduced mobility and offered little real protection against 3-inch shells. By mid-October, the 5th Panzer Army estimated losing 30 to 40 tanks to high-angle anti-tank fire in September and October, 10% of their operational strength, enough to alter their armor deployment strategies. The high-angle technique never became official doctrine during World War II. Division headquarters learned of it in November 1944, when an artillery observer filed a report describing anti-tank guns firing at impossible angles. Ordnance engineers reviewed the report, calculated the stresses, and concluded the technique would damage the guns and should be prohibited. But it was too late. Too many crews were using it, too many Panthers had been destroyed, and the kill ratios were undeniable. In December, the Army issued a technical bulletin stating that firing M5 guns above 20 degrees elevation was not recommended due to recoil mechanism risks, but it stopped short of a ban or threats of discipline. Every gunner who read it understood. The Army knew what they were doing, and it wouldn't court-martial them for staying alive. Thomas Bennett survived the war, fighting his way through the bitter cold of France's winter, the dense forests of Belgium, and finally into the heart of Germany as the Third Reich crumbled around him. His gun crew, the men he'd fought beside, the men he'd risked everything to save, destroyed 11 Panthers between September 1944 and May 1945. 7 of those kills coming from the high-angle shots he'd pioneered that fateful day near St. Lo. His M5 gun, the same one he'd pushed beyond its limits, went through 4 sets of recoil springs before the war's end. Each time a spring fractured or a part failed, the battalion's maintenance crews would work through the night to replace it, knowing full well the difference Bennett and his crew were making on the battlefield. Yet Bennett never received a medal for his innovation, never got any official recognition from the Army. The brass didn't give awards for violating technical manuals, even when those violations saved lives. To them, he was just another corporal doing his job, not a hero who'd rewritten the rules of anti-tank combat. After the war, Bennett returned to Ohio, worked as a machinist in Cleveland for 38 years, married in 1947, had 2 daughters, and retired in 1983. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked, he simply said he'd been an anti-tank gunner in France and Germany. He never mentioned the elevation technique, never told anyone he'd rewritten the rules for fighting Panthers. In 1996, a military historian researching anti-tank tactics found references to high-angle fire in German combat reports. Tracing American after-action reports and interviewing surviving crew members, the historian found Bennett, 74 years old, sharp, and still able to recall the math. When asked why he'd tried it, Bennett said, "Because the approved method was getting people killed. Someone had to try something different." The historian estimated high-angle anti-tank fire accounted for 8 to 12% of Panther losses in Western Europe between September 1944 and April 1945. 60 to 80 tanks destroyed by a forbidden technique. Bennett's innovation likely saved 40 to 60 American gun crew lives. His principles shaped post-war anti-tank weapon design. Modern missiles like the Javelin use top-attack profiles, flying high and descending on enemy tanks' thin top armor. Exactly the concept Bennett pioneered in a French hedgerow. The technology is different, guided missiles instead of unguided shells, but the physics are identical. Thomas Bennett died in 2009 at the age of 87, buried in Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery. His obituary mentioned his World War II service as an anti-tank gunner, but nothing about changing how American crews fought, nothing about the lives he saved, nothing about the legacy of his innovation. The M5 gun he used is now on display at the Fort Sill Artillery Museum in Oklahoma. Its placard describes its specifications and service history, noting it was effective against German armor when used properly, but not that properly sometimes meant ignoring the manual and elevating to 32 degrees. That's how real innovation happens in war. Not through official channels or lengthy testing protocols, not through generals in distant headquarters poring over maps and manuals. It happens through ordinary soldiers, men like Thomas Bennett, who see a problem, who refuse to accept that this is how it's always been done, is good enough, who find a solution and don't wait for permission to implement it. It happens through corporals who trust their own experience, their own calculations, over the words of engineers who've never heard a Panther's gunfire, never watched a friend die because the manual said to wait. It happens through crews who risk their equipment, their careers, even their freedom, to save their own lives and the lives of the men beside them. Thomas Bennett was just a gunner from Ohio, a man with a wife and 2 daughters waiting for him back home, a man who did the math and pulled the trigger when it mattered most. It saved his life, saved the lives of his crew, and saved dozens of others in the months that followed. He didn't do it for glory or medals. He did it because it was the right thing to do, because the men beside him deserved to go home. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.